I'm Stefano Pascucci. I'm professor in sustainability and circular economy at Exeter University. I'm based in the business school. I'm also working at the Environment and Sustainability Institute in Cornwall. Early days in my life, I was interested in the natural world. I'm Italian by background, as you can pick up from my accent. I'm a people person, so for me, food was the natural place to understand people and nature. I've been trying to ask questions and answer questions about food because it relates to people and nature ever since, basically.
Stefan Baum, originally from Germany. I'm also based in the business school. I'm also affiliated with the ESI, the Environment and Sustainability Institute. We share a passion for Cornwall. We're based down here for the past 5 years. Food is an interesting material kind of way of looking at the relationship between nature and society. It's essential for our health. It's essential for how we lead our lives. It's something we do on a daily basis. We eat. It's a huge economic factor as well, particularly in the southwest, particularly in Cornwall. Agri-food, that wider system, has a huge ecological footprint as well. So it kind of touches a lot of the things that are of grave interest to humanity at the moment. I mean, what we share is this kind of systematic view of problems, as it were. So food, not just the materiality of food, although that's important, but food as a system. We are always starting with a kind of a problem analysis. What is the problem here?
I think for me, really the turning point, sort of game changer in terms of realizing that beyond view that we have about food, or even the trivialized view that we have about food, it's a place where a lot of struggles are happening. One particular thing has changed my way of engaging with agriculture and food from a system perspective. The realization 15 years ago that what we call the industrialized food system, the globalized food value chains, are all based on a very extractive approach to nature and natural resources. Suddenly, I was confronted with the idea, this is not very different from literally mining the soil, mining biodiversity, extracting or exploiting people. So that's got the social dimension. And that was the problem part. And then I said, okay, how can we change that? How can we make this less extractive or perhaps not extractive altogether? And ever since, I've been focusing on that aspect. That's basically the big problem, how we move away from extractive agriculture, particularly.
I'm always interested in the economic aspects of life and then seeing them in combination of the environmental challenges. So on the economic side, part of the industrialization of the food system is that the food system seems to be more and more dominated by large corporations. So if you look globally, few seed companies are dominating the world. In many countries, such as the UK, many other European and Western nice countries, you have, for example, supermarkets that have dominated access to food. Just over the last half a century, and in some countries only over the last 20, 30 years. So historically speaking, very, very short amount of time, supermarkets have really become very, very dominant in the food system, which has repercussions for producers on the one side and of course for consumers on the other side. Analyzing these repercussions, farmers around the world are struggling to make a living. That's not healthy, economically speaking, and there's a huge problem with land-based livelihoods and businesses being viable. That's a global problem. On the other side, consumers are struggling as well to have access to food. Food poverty is rife, particularly in the current pandemic. Lots of people are going to food banks. And here we're not even considering malnutrition and food poverty from an existentialist point of view in many sub-Saharan countries in other parts of the world. I've spent a huge amount of time looking at climate change. What is often not appreciated is that the agri-food system, in particular food waste, contributes a massive amounts to climate change. For example, food waste alone contributes much more to greenhouse gas emissions than the global aviation industry. And so food waste is a huge problem. It typically releases methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But of course, from a food systems wider perspective, industrialized agriculture consumes a huge amount of fossil fuels, both in terms of working the land with tractors, distributing the food, but also fertilizers produced with the help of fossil fuels. The environmental footprint just on the climate change side is massive.
It's good that you mentioned climate change, because that's another romanticized approach to agriculture. So we think that agriculture is always aligned with natural ecological processes, but often it's not. I think that sort of less covered approach is indeed about soil health. Soil, in general terms, it's really a complex ecosystem. And of course, as any ecosystem changes according to the circumstances, what happens, particularly intense uses of fertilizers, for example, is that you alter biochemical processes, altering the old food web in the soil. So if you look at the soil, the underground as an habitat, an ecosystem at the same time, there are ways of re-engaging and revitalizing the capacity of soil to offer nutrients and basically what plants may need. But that's not happening, hasn't happened for a long time in so-called industrialized applications. When you think about monoculture or specialized cropping, the problem is not only in terms of the interaction between crops, the wider environment and the atmosphere, if you like, but something is happening also underground that we are not aware of. So the mystery of the complex of the soil, it's something that scientists perhaps should tackle more openly and just more in the future than we're doing.
And you mentioned agriculture being an extractive process. So I think that's how I visualize it, that we're literally extracting nutrients and the goodness out of the soil. Then we do something with it, we eat it, and then we dispose of it. A typical take, make, dispose linear process. And what we leave then on the soil side are basically dead soils in some cases, right? That need to replenish using industrial fertilizers.
15 years ago, I was in a network of professionals and academics discussing basically the future of food. And a number of really big companies were realizing that they were experiencing declining productivity in many sourcing areas, increased volatility. They had sourcing problems. The stability of the raw materials that they were relying on was becoming really a big strategic problem. So the message I kind of learned was that even in big corporations who are really focused on profit, there is internally wider discussion.
There's sometimes this sentiment out there that the human race can just manage nature and technologize nature in whatever shape or form. And I think that is misguided. Malnutrition and food poverty, which seem strange to mention in one sentence, but the food system produces an extreme and ever more grave obesity crisis that is not just a problem of the so-called Western world, but in places like Brazil, even China, and many other so-called middle-income countries, obesity is now rising very, very fast.
So I think part of what we can do as social scientists particularly is to try to figure out, okay, how can we reintroduce practices? How can we re-engage in food provisioning, even trying to start making our own food? I think the place-based approach, trying to contextualize food provisioning, for example, or procurement could be an interesting angle.
The place-based approach, I think, is holding promise, not only improving human health, but also environmental health and economic health. So these three main pillars of what we call our circular food approach. I've been very interested, just to give you an example, of the community-supported agriculture approach, in short CSA, consumers. They're sometimes called prosumer system. What a prosumer system is all about is bringing consumers and producers together, actively seeking to involve people, communities nearby, to come onto the field, to be part of the food growing business, to get involved, get their hands dirty, which has three benefits, the three important dimensions of the food system. So on the human health side, we have, for example, got a huge mental health crisis. There's a lot of evidence out there, and I've done research on that myself with some colleagues in the east of England, where we've shown that if people get actively involved in growing food, that massively impacts positively their mental health. Economic health-wise, it's got benefits for the farmer because CSAs can run in a variety of different ways, but one popular model is that farmers are signing up customers on a yearly basis, which produces economic security for the farmer. It has a very short supply chain. And on the environmental side, you've got benefits because you've got radically lower carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, because the supply chains make a big difference in terms of transport costs, for example. And then if on top of that, the farmer introduces what are called agroecological principles, which basically means you do farming together with nature rather than against nature. You improve the soils, you use no or very little fertilizers and pesticides. You introduce a whole range of farming techniques which are much more ecologically sound than the typical industrial system. Then you have a whole range of environmental benefits as well. So this is one of the solutions.
I suppose this is a fantastic example of both place-based and system-wide perspective on we engage with food and also multidimensional, let alone the interdisciplinary perspective.
Food focus works particularly in a place like Cornwall, but also Devon, where the agri-food sector is dominant. The hospitality sector and agriculture plays a huge role in terms of employment, in terms of business activities in our region.
I've been working with a few of those larger companies, and we're particularly active, basically what we would call global value chains, particularly when you look at sourcing of the raw materials. So really, rather than looking into the globalized chain downstream towards markets and customers, I've been working with a few companies in their supply chain sourcing strategies. So in a nutshell, their relationship with farmers, cooperatives, and producers associations, including Barilla, who is a big food and bakery with global brands. I think what's happening, what I'm learning from this experience is that we should look into value chains as innovation ecosystems, unpacking a bit further the role of corporates in those innovation ecosystems. I think often we end up in false dichotomies. Definitely the role of big companies in food systems is problematic, but there is a lot of experimentations happening. What we have been doing the last few years has been trying to understand how by reorganizing value chains, the relations in the value chains, but also power relations in the value chains, we can support the adoption and diffusion of what we would call circular food or regenerative agricultural practices. There are some very basic practices like crop rotation, the fact that you don't have to necessarily do only monocropping, the same crop every year on the same field. That's something very basic. But then when you start diversifying the agricultural system, then there is a window of opportunity to start doing other things. You can introduce more agroecology, integrated pest control. There are a number of environmental sensitive, if you like, practices that you can start doing. And because we are in a heavily commodified world anyway, there is a recognition that access to market, we would call it a few decades ago, participating into value chain, being able to source to a big company, sometimes together with public support, could become an instrument to facilitate this adoption and diffusion process. But that's tricky because all institutional arrangements, including contracts, have been developed to support, in the type of study I'm doing, only monoculture. So a very dominant approach in supply chains is, for example, using contract farming. And contract farming is a typical arrangement between, say, a farmer and a buyer, a processor, for example, based on supporting production of one specific commodity and do that for many farmers at the same time in order to get the critical mass that you need for one specific commodity. Now, how can you move from that space? How can you design contracts, arrangements, and use technology to do that, to diversify your sourcing, to diversify the farmers and farming systems that you are engaging with? And it's quite a challenge because sometimes you operate in a sort of institutional vacuum, void, where there are no standards, no public support, no clear regulations or norms. So it's quite an exciting also institutional context for a researcher. So there is the impact side and the outreaching side. We have been experimenting supply chain arrangements, contracts, that could help more farmers to adopt regenerative practices.
Let's go back to technology, because technology is often hailed as this kind of solution to all the grand challenges, or capture storage solutions and these kind of, it's always the technology where a lot of hope is put into.
The tricky part of technology, or whatever type of technology applied to food or agriculture you think of, is that often, rather than an enabler, has been used as a way of further simplifying the complexity of ecological processes. And this idea of controlling nature and against all the odds and evidence, actually, sometimes. 10 years ago, the movement around climate smart agriculture or precision agriculture started. And with the illusion, in my view, that just by doing that, you would fix climate change problems related to food systems, for example. Of course, you can reduce some negative impacts, but you will never move away from the trap of being extractive, for example, with the soil. So you may fix one problem, reducing your energy consumption or emissions or whatever you're trying to minimize, then you won't fix the wider holistic problem of how you manage your agriculture or agroecological systems. There is evidence that now we can use technology, and quite sophisticated technology, including big data and sensors and drones, for more crafted, place-based, dedicated solutions. I think the new frontier is this capacity, because it's becoming less and less costly, to kind of craft around each farmer a solution that could be regenerative and could be circular, or at least considering environmental benefits, basically.
Because I think what technology, particularly online systems, big data systems, etc., help us is to see literally the wood for the trees and integrate great actors with each other who find it normally difficult to speak to each other, or to even see that the other exists. A new initiative based in Devon, but very much with wider regional ambitions, called the Southwest Food Hub, is, they're trying to set up a sophisticated online system, and I should say an online procurement system, where small farmers, small producers, smallholders, they often can't take part in these kind of public procurement systems at all. So what Southwest Food Hub and others are trying to do is to localize, regionalize procurement systems, and here technology can help to bring these smaller producers to the fore. And I think the revolution of the internet is that it is providing more of a level playing field where everyone has the potential of taking part in society and the wider marketplace. And I think that is the promise of technology for this particular approach. So one idea I've had for quite a long time now, and I would love to have the funding to run a variety of pilots and test beds, where we kind of really have a new radical procurement system, people knowing where the food comes from, and it gives economic security and benefits to the local producers, rather than currently, you have large international food procurers. So I think we need to think of these sort of institutional innovations, where we kind of think of how big institutions such as universities, such as hospitals, other institutions in the public sphere can really reimagine food procurement. So there are innovations that are already happening. There's something called the Preston model in the UK. In Lancashire, Preston City Council, people there have for many years now innovated around localizing procurement, not just on the food side, but in other areas as well. So there are examples out there, best practices of where this has been tried around the world. And I think we can learn from that and really see how that can improve the food system in a specific locale.
I suppose there is a generative element into it. It means really moving out of that extractive, exploitative approach to producing, procuring, provisioning food in a more general sense. There is a sense of realigning with an ecological view or worldview, or at least recognizing that we are dealing with ecological processes. And there is a sense of place-based that should prevail. It's circular because it's got this focus on the natural capital and ecological processes. It could enhance the quality of the environment, in my view, rather than keep minimizing negative impacts, which is part of what circular economy may be focused on.
The range of problems we outlined earlier are based on the view that not just the environment that is in deep crisis, but economy is in a deep crisis, not just because of the pandemic, but economic inequality is rife and rising and has been for many decades. So the economic system really is broken in many ways, and even mainstream economists would agree with that. And we've got a whole range of social and human health problems which are very, very critical. So food is this kind of go-to area that ideally is seen from a systems point of view and is able to talk to the ecological side, to the human health, social side, as well as the economic side. And that's why I think it's such a very important focal point, I think, from a research trajectory point of view. It's regenerative from a social and human health point of view, because it's provisioning the right nutrients for our food intake, but also economically regenerative, because a lot of value is often concentrated in a few hands and not giving local producers, local businesses and workers in a region, not giving them enough of the pie that's available, essentially. So we need to kind of redistribute that economic pie and give local producers in the food sector in particular more of a chance to take part in procurement systems, take part in the food system, and make a decent living. Thanks for your time, Stefano.
Thanks for your time, Stefan.
And let's see where this goes. But I think it's been great to talk about this, have this conversation, makes a lot of things clear for us, and hopefully makes things a bit clearer for our audience as well.